see all of you tonight. So welcome to tonight's talk from the Park Street Corporation Speaker Series in Health, Humanity, and Ethics. As many of you know, this series was founded in 2017 with the help of a general request from the Quinn family. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Park Street Corporation for their generous gift, which aligned the late Father Quinn's interests in social justice and ethics so well with the mission of Boston College. So I'm Summer Hawkins. I'm based in the School of Social Work, and my co-directors, Amy Boyski and Jim Keenan, and I have been asked to bring to campus local, national, and international leaders to address timely issues in the intersecting fields of health, humanities, and ethics. This year's speakers have all reflected in different ways on the theme of hard choices. Tonight we'll begin with a brief introduction by Holly Fontenot, Associate Professor at the Cornell School of Nursing, who will introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Greg Zimet. The talk will conclude with time for questions and discussion. I also want to remind everyone that our next Park Street Speaker Series will be Dr. Norman Spack on Thursday, March 19th at 7 p.m. here in Gaston 100. Dr. Spack will speak about treating transgender adolescents early to avoid self-harm. Let me ask you now to please silence or turn off cell phones and join me in welcoming Professor Fontenot, who will introduce our guest tonight.
It's nice to see so many people show up tonight. I'm Holly Fontenot. I'm from the School of Nursing, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, and most importantly, mentor, Dr. Greg Zimet. He's a professor of pediatrics and clinical psychology in the Division of Adolescent Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine. He also holds an adjunct appointment in the School of Nursing. In addition to that, he's the co-director of the Indiana University and Purdue University Indianapolis Center for HPV Research. He served as the president of the Society of Adolescent Health and Medicine from 2016 to 17. And Dr. Zimet started investigating attitudes about vaccines for adolescents in the mid-90s. Much of his research has involved the study of vaccine acceptance and refusal, with a primary focus over the past 20 years on attitudes about HPV vaccine, as well as behavioral and social determinants of HPV vaccination. His studies have focused on adolescents, young adults, parents of adolescents, and healthcare providers, and include evaluations of HPV vaccine communication and vaccine communication in general and intervention studies. Of relevance to this talk, Dr. Zimet has been collaborating with colleagues to investigate the impact of HPV vaccine school entry requirements on vaccination rates, and has co-authored several articles on policy and ethical issues related to HPV vaccine, and this is in addition to his other much broader work and many other publications. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Zimet. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Holly, for that nice introduction. And thank you, Summer, as well. Thank you for inviting me here for this talk. And I hope we're not just entertained, but that the talk is somewhat thought-provoking. So we'll see about that. So first I want to start with my disclosures. So I'm completely clear on where I've received funding, which includes from some pharmaceutical companies as well as from the NIH. So I'm going to talk briefly about the kind of topics I want to cover, but I also want to give some background information about HPV vaccination in the US. I've been steeped in HPV for like 20 years, but I sometimes forget that not everyone is obsessed with it as I am, so I do want to give some background. I'm going to spend most of the talk talking about school entry requirements and some of the ethical issues related to that, and not just ethical, but sort of pragmatic policy issues. Time permitting, I'm going to go over a few other ethical and policy issues as well. So these are the main issues that I want to cover. Again, my main focus is going to be school entry requirements, but I'm going to talk about the issue of gender or sex and HPV vaccination, and how that continues to play a role in our policies and people's understanding. The global shortage of HPV vaccine, which has arisen as a big concern recently. There's a new recommendation for adults 27 through 45 for HPV vaccine, but the recommendation is shared clinical decision-making. It's not a routine recommendation, which differentiates it from the recommendation for younger ages. So I want to talk about that a little bit and what that means. And then just very briefly talk about the prospects for a one-dose HPV vaccine schedule, which would be a huge boon because it would make, particularly if we talk about low and lower middle income countries, it would be just, I can't even say how much of an advantage it would be because it would save them money, it would overcome all sorts of logistical challenges. So a quick note on terminology. So I'm going to use the term school entry requirement and mandates interchangeably. Mandate sometimes because it fits better on the slide, it's shorter, it's also easier to say, but I want to say that the term school entry requirement is a much more accurate phrase in terms of what it's intended to describe, and it better captures the concept. So let me start with the background. So I'm going to be on this slide for a little while because it's a complicated slide, as you can see. Let's see it. Okay. So, can you hear me okay? Okay, so maybe I won't use the microphone right here. So you can see in 2006, the quadrivalent HPV vaccine was licensed for females ages 9 through 26 with the focused recommendation on 11 and 12-year-old girls. So that, and this was the vaccine that is commonly known as Gardasil. So this was Merck's vaccine. GlaxoSmithKline also had a vaccine, which is a bivalent vaccine called Cervarix, which some of you may have heard of. There was a delay in Cervarix's approval by the FDA. It was delayed by 3 years. So Cervarix didn't get licensed until 2009. So that bivalent vaccine, same recommendation, ages 9 through 26, with a focus on ages 11 to 12. In 2009, the other change is that quadrivalent vaccine was licensed for males 9 through 26 for prevention of genital warts. This was called a permissive recommendation, and that is to say, the recommendation said it can be given to males if the parents want it, or in discussion with the provider if the parents want it. So that was 2009. So 2011 was another notable change. By then, it was shown that HPV didn't just cause genital warts in males and females, but also caused anal cancers and precancers. So this changed everything. So they changed the recommendation for that quadrivalent Gardasil vaccine to a routine recommendation, not permissive anymore, for males 11 through 21. It can start as early as age 9. But at age 23 to 26, they deviated from the female recommendation, and it's a permissive recommendation for most males ages 22 to 26, except for those deemed at risk for infection. And that's males with immunocompromising conditions, men who have sex with men, and they just started, as years went on, they kept adding in groups. And there were several of us, myself and several of my colleagues, that were very impatient for them to harmonize the recommendation. This is an example of really bad public health policy to have this kind of carve out for one sex, for one little age group. So that was 2011. Then in 2014, the 9-valent HPV vaccine was licensed and recommended, and over a relatively short period of time replaced all of Gardasil. This is called Gardasil 9. It's now the only vaccine available in the US. 2016, the bivalent vaccine was pulled from the market by GSK. Cervarix was gone from the US market, still used in some other countries. That 3-year delay and the fact that it was never intended for males and never licensed for males was the kiss of death for Cervarix, basically. And GSK realized that they just didn't have a market for it in the US. Also, in 2016, came a new recommendation. So it had been 3 doses for everyone. The World Health Organization had already changed it at some point to 2 doses for those under 15 years of age, and the CDC followed suit. They changed it to a two-dose recommendation as long as the first dose was given by age 14, or before age 15, same thing. So then the next policy change was in 2018. So the FDA, at the end of 2018, based on data provided to them, decided that it was reasonable to license the vaccine for ages 27 through 45 for males and females. So that was, what, 2018, so over a year ago. It then took the CDC and their advisory committee on immunization practices, which sets policy, to try to figure out what to do with that recommendation. They were very uncomfortable with it, and there was some disagreement in the committee. But what they ended up coming up with is that this shared clinical decision-making, SCDM recommendation for adults 27 to 45, which is similar to what was previously called a permissive recommendation. The other thing they did is they finally harmonized the male and female recommendation. So now, HPV vaccine is recommended routinely, basically for ages 9 through 26, for males and females, and for males and females 27 to 45. It's a shared clinical decision-making recommendation, and time permitting, I'll go over that a little bit. It's sort of complicated. So that's sort of the history of policy. I'm sure I've missed some things, but that covers the high points of HPV vaccine policy. So how have we done with HPV vaccination? So what I want you to look at first, so if you look at the top two lines, this is from 2012 through 2018 data. The top two lines are the tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis booster, which is routinely administered at ages 11 to 12. And this is the meningococcal ACWY vaccine, again, routinely recommended for ages 11 to 12. The Healthy People 2020 goal for those two vaccines is 80% coverage. We often don't meet Healthy People 2020 goals. We met the Healthy People 2020 goal for those two vaccines. You can see it's well over 80%. The top line here is one dose of HPV vaccine for girls, and the line here is for boys. And you can see we're in the high 60s, basically, in terms of coverage for one dose for boys and girls. But if you look at the slope of the line for girls, it's really very mild, and it's actually flattened out a little bit. For boys, it's been a sharper slope, and that's why, basically there's almost no difference overall in the nation between boys and girls now. This is combined boys and girls in terms of completion of the 2 or 3 dose series, what's called up to date. And you can see that it's just over a little over 50% for the country. So this is what we call this gap here, from here to here, or from here to here, is what we call missed opportunities. So these are young people getting other vaccines that are due, but they're not getting HPV vaccine, and they're eligible. So trying to understand why is there this difference between meningococcal vaccine, Tdap, and HPV vaccine. So this is a map of vaccine mandates for meningococcal ACWY. And you can see any state that's not in white has a school entry requirement. So most states currently have a school entry requirement, including Massachusetts. Even more impressive, every state has a Tdap school entry requirement. So basically, for 11 and 12-year-olds, both of these vaccines in the majority or all states, are required vaccines for school entry. Let's look at HPV vaccine. So this is what we have with HPV vaccine. So we have Virginia, and I have to tell you, Virginia is not really a school entry requirement. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's Rhode Island, which is, as usual, kind of hard to find, but there it is. They do have a real school entry requirement. The District of Columbia has one, and Hawaii is implementing one. So, if we think about, again, the disparities in vaccination between Tdap, meninge, and HPV, a lot of it has to do with which vaccines are required for school entry. So this is just a map of the US which shows the variation in initiation of HPV vaccination from state to state. And the darker the color, the higher the initiation rate. And you can see there's tremendous variability in rates of initiation. The Northeast in general does pretty well. The West Coast does pretty well, and there's some areas in the middle. The South in general does very poorly. And some other states don't do so well either, like Wyoming and Utah. So there's, this is an important point. There's tremendous geographic variability and disparities. And here's another way of looking at this. This is up to date, which means series completion for HPV vaccination. And you can see the US as a whole is a little over 50%, as I mentioned. Then Rhode Island is the star. They're almost at 80%, which is the Healthy People 2020 goal. So they're the only state that has come close to reaching that. Massachusetts has done pretty well, better than the nation as a whole. And the state that is at the bottom is Mississippi, with only, 33% completing the HPV vaccine series. Again, tremendous disparities and changes from state to state. There's also tremendous variability within states. And this is an important point. So this is from some research I did with the vaccine registry in Indiana. Indiana has 92 counties. So I didn't know actually until I started doing this, even though I've lived there for over 26 years. And this is actually missed opportunity. So again, these are situations where an adolescent received one of the other vaccines, which in this case were meningococcal, Tdap, or hepatitis A vaccine. They were eligible for HPV vaccine, but did not receive the vaccine. So you can see the red are the ones with the highest rates of missed opportunities. Green, yellow's in the middle, and green has the lowest rates of missed opportunities. So even within a state like Indiana, there's tremendous variability. I have colleagues who've done similar studies in Utah and Florida, and again, there's tremendous variability from place to place. The other thing that's become a major focus in HPV vaccine policy and research is the urban-rural disparities in vaccine coverage. So here you can see this is, again, initiation of HPV vaccination, one or more doses. This is a non-metropolitan statistical area, so that's like rural. This is sort of peri-urban and urban. And this is 3-dose completion or 2-dose completion up to date. Again, you can see that linear relationship as you get to more urban areas, there's an increase in series completion. In comparison, again, you see Tdap, which there's no disparities. There's no urban-rural disparities for that vaccine. So how do we address these kind of geographic and urban-rural disparities and other kinds of disparities that we see with HPV vaccination? And I would argue that school entry requirements may be the best tool that we could use. So one thing is, in this country, the primary policy tool we use to achieve high vaccination rates is through school entry requirements. That's not true in every country. Different countries have different ways of achieving high vaccination. But for this country, that's been the major tool. Unfortunately, one of the difficulties is school entry requirements are determined on a state-by-state basis. So there's tremendous, as there's variability in vaccination from state to state, there's a lot of variability in school entry requirements from state to state. The requirements for obtaining exemptions to vaccination also differ from state to state. And it has to be said, and we'll talk about this more, it's certainly a political challenge to consider implementing school entry requirements for HPV vaccination. So this is a map of state-by-state exemption approaches. So there's basically 3 categories of exemptions. There's medical exemptions. All states have medical exemptions. There can be religious exemptions. So some states have medical and religious exemptions. Some states also have personal belief exemptions. And so you can have all three or just one being medical. So you can see in the entire country, there's very few states that have only medical exemptions. California is one because they passed a law in 2015 to change their exemptions. It used to be easier to opt out of vaccination than to get your kid vaccinated in California. That's no longer the case. Mississippi, surprisingly, has only medical exemptions, as does West Virginia. New York apparently just recently adopted this in response to the measles outbreaks, and it looks like Maine as well. But the majority of states have additional exemptions besides medical, including Indiana, which has medical and religious exemptions. And if you look at Indiana law, the religious exemption basically says, if you think that your sincerely held religious beliefs tell you that you shouldn't vaccinate your child, then you don't need to. So it's more of a personal belief exemption. So the legal basis for school entry requirements is really about putting the law on the side of children and protecting children. So the three of the principles, bioethical principles, beneficence, we want to ensure that the right thing happens and we protect our children from harm. Non-malfeasance, that we don't let bad things happen to them. Like, for instance, cervical cancer, anal cancer, oropharyngeal cancer. And justice, that we want to protect everyone equally. And those disparities that I showed you really violate the idea of justice. I have another timeline for you, because I know you enjoyed the last one so much. So this is a timeline showing some of the history of HPV vaccination and school entry requirements. So remember, HPV vaccine was licensed in 2006. It didn't take long for some states to immediately begin considering legislation for school entry requirements. It started in 2006 towards the end of the year. And some of you may be aware or may remember, but in 2007, the Texas legislature considered and decided not to implement school entry requirements, but the governor, Rick Perry, at the time, issued an executive order to implement school entry requirements, which is very strange. The Texas legislature overruled him. Now, it turns out that Rick Perry had some connections to Merck. And so it was a situation where, as people followed the money, that was the accepted explanation of why he issued this executive order. But again, the legislature overruled it. So it turns out Merck had been doing a lot of behind-the-scenes lobbying through 2006 and early 2007, which backfired spectacularly. It was a really bad idea, and I don't know what they were thinking. But after this backlash, they chose to stop lobbying, which was a smart move. But it really, this whole sequence of events really set back HPV vaccination significantly. So then in 2007, Virginia implemented what I call a non-mandate mandate, which was set to start and started in 2008, and I'll give you the language of that non-mandate mandate in a minute. And then in 2009, the District of Columbia implemented, again, the quote-unquote mandate. Both of those were initially for females only because, in 2007, it wasn't yet recommended or licensed for males. 2015, finally, Rhode Island implemented a true gender-neutral school entry requirement. It was initiated through public health authority, not through legislation. In 2017, Puerto Rico initiated a mandate, and then Hawaii has implemented a mandate or school entry requirement that's due to start later this year in the fall. So here's Virginia's so-called school mandate requirement, or school entry requirement. So effective October 1st, 2008, a complete series of 3 doses of HPV vaccine is required for females. The first dose shall be administered before the child enters the 6th grade. After reviewing educational materials approved by the Board of Health, the parent or guardian, this is my emphasis, at the parent's or guardian's sole discretion may elect for the child not to receive the HPV vaccine. So this is an unenforceable law. And I guess my question for you to be thinking about as we go on here is, does this law meet the minimal requirement for a mandate? Is this really a mandate? My argument, obviously, is that it isn't. So Washington, D.C. school entry requirement initially was, again, females only. They updated it to include males. And it's been somewhat successful, but it's interesting because HPV vaccine is the only vaccine for which parents are given a link to the opt-out form on the government website. So again, it's treated differently from other vaccines that are required for school entry. So let me move on to talk about school entry requirements. It's kind of a hot, controversial issue. You probably can already tell that my bias is in favor of school entry requirements. I think it's a tool that we have to use in this country, and it's the most effective way to protect children and young people from later devastating diseases. But there are arguments, and I want to try to be fair and present some of the most frequently cited arguments against school entry requirements. So I think the biggest one, or among the first two here are maybe the biggest ones. One, that vaccine mandates interfere with parental autonomy and authority to make decisions regarding their children's health. It's a big issue. Understandably, parents don't like being told what to do for their children. The second one, HPV vaccine prevents a sexually transmitted infection which differentiates it from all other compulsory vaccines. And these other vaccines supposedly prevent infections that are easily transmitted in a school setting. And we'll address that one as well. Opt-out provisions impose an unfair burden on parents who do not want their children vaccinated. This is obviously an issue for any vaccine that gets brought up. The fourth one, which astounds me that anyone would say this, but I've heard this said, is we have limited healthcare dollars and cervical cancer is not a prevalent problem in the US. School entry requirements work for other vaccines, but not for HPV vaccine. This also may sound silly, but this was the party line for members of the CDC up until a couple of years ago and for some of my colleagues. And lastly, was this sort of sense that we shouldn't even talk about school entry requirements because it's too controversial a topic and politically difficult. So let's deal with the first one here. Vaccine mandates interfere with parental authority, autonomy and authority to make decisions. So, first of all, parental autonomy and decision-making about a child's health has always been curtailed to some extent. That the state takes an interest in child welfare, and that's why we have abuse and neglect and medical neglect laws. So that parental autonomy is not unlimited. And as one person wrote about HPV vaccine, minors have a right to be protected against vaccine-preventable illness, and society has an interest in safeguarding the welfare of children who may be harmed by the choices of their parents or guardians. And then, as Bayevsky said in a very recent article, vaccination against HPV should be universal, not only for the sake of each vaccinated individual, but for the sake of the community as a whole. So part of the reason behind school entry requirements is protection of the child, but it's what we call community immunity or herd immunity. Community immunity is a little more acceptable term. None of us like to be thought of as cows, so it's a helpful term. But do the benefits of protection against HPV infection warrant the government imposing requirements that supersede parental authority? So I believe strongly that this determination should be made on the basis of evidence, not on mythology. So, first question, does HPV vaccination prevent devastating diseases that are personally and societally costly? And the answer is absolutely, it does. You look at the diseases, genital warts, terrible kind of thing to happen, very costly to treat, creates psychological issues, not, a huge problem for health, but a concern. But you look at the cancers, There are 6 cancers that are caused by HPV and that the vaccine almost certainly prevents. And it's cervical cancer, anal cancers, vaginal, vulvar, penile, and oropharyngeal cancers. And these cancers create enormous suffering and pain for the individual, for their families. They're incredibly costly for the individual and their families and for the healthcare system. So these are devastating diseases that can be prevented through vaccination. So the answer to that first question is yes. So is HPV vaccine safe? Again, the answer is yes. And I would be lying. Sometimes people like to say it's completely safe, 100% safe. Nothing is 100% safe. Nothing. If you decide the world is unsafe, I'm just going to lay in bed, you're going to get bed sores, which will get infected, and you're going to die. So nothing is 100% safe. If you decide, well, I'm going to get out of bed because staying in bed is too dangerous, and you get out of bed, you step on a pair of shoes that you threw there on the floor, you fall, you hit your head on the bed frame, and you die. Everything is, has a risk associated with it. So what I like to say about HPV vaccine, or almost any vaccine, I am 100% certain that getting vaccinated is safer than not getting vaccinated. So the answer to safety is yes. The HPV vaccine has been studied so much for safety. And there are Scandinavian studies I was talking about in this discussion group that we had. There are Scandinavian studies where they compare 1 million vaccinated girls to 2 million unvaccinated girls. If you can't detect problems with a vaccine when you have a sample size that large, there just aren't going to be problems to detect. So should HPV vaccine be administered to school-age children? And I would say yes. It's a preventive vaccine. So like pretty much every vaccine we have, it's not therapeutic. It's not for treatment of a disease. It's to prevent infection of the disease. So we want to administer it prior to risk of exposure to the pathogen. So we should be vaccinating young people. I actually argue that we should start at ages 9 and 10. It's licensed for that age. That way you can finish it up at age 11 or 12 and give them the other vaccines and you're done. So let's take the second issue. HPV vaccine prevents an STI, differentiating it from all other compulsory vaccines, which prevent infections that are easily transmitted in the school setting. I have colleagues who sort of laugh about this and say, well, yeah, it's maybe not like measles, but that HPV sometimes is transmitted in the school setting. But putting that aside, I think the key question, is it true that we only use school entry requirements to prevent infections that are easily transmitted in the school setting? And the answer is no. So we have tetanus, which is part of the Tdap and the DTaP vaccines, okay? That's the T, is tetanus, there's diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. So tetanus is not a communicable infection. It is a weak one. It's a weak precedent because tetanus is part of a 3-part vaccine, and pertussis is certainly a communicable illness. But we have a strong precedent, which is hepatitis B virus vaccine. So this is a vaccine that's required for school entry. It's now administered right after birth, basically, and it's required for school entry. It used to be required for school entry in middle schools, like meningococcal and Tdap, but now it's been pulled back to early infancy, really. So hepatitis B is not transmitted in crowds. It's also most typically transmitted through sexual activity, through sharing needles, and that's, again, not something we tend to worry about in school settings. So that's a strong precedent. We have another vaccine that we've been requiring for school entry for years. We also have other government-imposed mandates related to children's health, and just one example is that all states have automobile child restraint laws. So the government does impose mandates to protect children's health, and if you think about it, child restraint is about the individual child's health. It's not about herd immunity, right? It's not about protecting other people so much. And we're willing to have that kind of mandate. And it seems to me we should be willing to protect both children and other individuals that they may come in contact with. So the idea that opt-out provisions impose an unfair burden on parents who do not want their children vaccinated. So again, this is not just HPV, this is an argument made about all vaccines. So it is true that there's an advantage of lenient, easily obtained vaccine exemptions, is that they provoke less backlash. The disadvantage, and this is a huge disadvantage, is that they lead to lower rates of vaccination and higher rates of vaccine-preventable illnesses. Well documented by many studies over the years. And again, the purpose of school entry requirements is to reduce the rate of vaccine-preventable illnesses. So, and the other thing I would say is that if a person does hold a deeply held, sincere religious belief against vaccination, they should be willing to go to a little extra trouble to get an exemption. I mean, if they really believe that strongly, then I think imposing a little bit of inconvenience is not unreasonable. But it also has to be said that there is no established religion that proscribes vaccination. It's simply not the case. Whether you're talking about Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, even Christian Scientists, there is no religion that proscribes vaccination. We have limited healthcare dollars, and cervical cancer is not a prevalent problem in the US. So if you compare cervical cancer to lung cancer and breast cancer, it is not, it doesn't come close in terms of the incidence. However, it's not insignificant. Cervical cancers, and we're just talking about cervical cancer, we're not talking about anal cancers and oropharyngeal cancers. Cervical cancers still account for 3,000 to 4,000 deaths per year in the US and about 11,000 diagnoses each year. And again, as I mentioned, HPV vaccination also reduces the incidences of anal, vaginal, vulvar, and most likely oropharyngeal and penile cancers. There's a lot of indirect evidence about oropharyngeal cancers, but they weren't part of the clinical trials for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into, but if you want me to talk about later, I can do that. Also, repeated cost-effectiveness studies, and as I was saying to a group earlier, there have been more cost-effectiveness studies done with HPV vaccine than any other vaccine. And they show that it is a very cost-effective vaccine. So HPV vaccination of young adolescents is far more cost-effective than meningococcal vaccination, which is required for school entry in most states in the US. So I wanted to talk a little bit about oropharyngeal cancer and why it's a particular issue and concern in the US, in high-income countries in general. So on the left of your screen, it shows the incidence of cervical cancers worldwide. And you'll see that the more red the color, the higher the incidence, that in parts of South and Central America and Sub-Saharan Africa and a few other parts of the world have disproportionate burden of cervical cancer diagnosis. The map on your right is the similar map for oropharyngeal cancers, which is almost like a mirror image. So the highest incidence of oropharyngeal cancer is in the US, Canada, and Western Europe. So this has been a huge concern because it's been a rapidly increasing cancer in the US. So this just shows you the rate of increase here from 1975 to 2014. And you can see just what an astounding increase has been in oropharyngeal cancer. Overall, about a 57% increase over that time period, largely in white males. I mean, 92% increase among white males. Among black males, there's a slight decrease. Among white females, a slight increase. And among black females, a little bit of a decrease. So that's just to say that oropharyngeal cancers are an increasing focus and an increasing concern. Though it's not a label indication of the vaccine for prevention of oropharyngeal cancer, the likelihood is that the vaccine does prevent them. So going back to the school entry requirements, the fifth argument that they work for other vaccines but not for HPV vaccine. So this false conclusion was based on the weak mandates in Virginia and DC when it was first implemented. So I would argue that the failure of the Virginia mandate in particular is not a failure of school entry requirements, but a predictable failure of poor public health policy. And just as an analogy, let's say I decided to build a chair. And this is the chair that I built. And then a number of my friends came over and I had each of them sit in the chair and they kept falling out of it. Would you say chairs don't work? Or would you say I'm a bad carpenter? Right? So Virginia school entry requirement is at best a two-legged chair, maybe a one-legged chair, maybe a chair with no legs, I don't know. So what happens when we look at an actual well-designed policy, which is Rhode Island's policy? What do we find when we look at the effects of Rhode Island's school entry requirement? So we've done that in 2 studies, and I'm just going to show you very quick summaries of our findings. But we used what's called a difference in differences approach, where we compared Rhode Island HPV vaccination rates over time to a comparison group, which was all other states. So we did 2 studies. These were both studies with the National Immunization Survey team data, which is a CDC survey that is done every year. And it has both parent-reported vaccination and provider-verified reported vaccination. So we know that parent-reported HPV vaccination is a reasonably good measure, but not great. People don't always remember accurately. The provider-verified vaccination is actually a very, very rigorous measure. So first we did, the other thing I would say is that parent report is a much larger sample than the provider-verified data. So when we first looked at this, we didn't have as many years to look at, so we wanted to focus on the parent report data. And you can see here, so this top green solid line is females in Rhode Island. This dotted line is females in the rest of the country. And you can look, Rhode Island is a star. So, even before the school entry requirements, they were doing really well. So they're higher than the rest of the country for females. But the lines essentially are parallel from beginning to end here, from 2010 to 2016. The top solid blue line is males. And the dotted line is males in every other state. These are Rhode Island males. You can see it parallels, it goes along just the same, perfectly parallel, up until 2015 when the school entry requirement was initiated. And then there's this sharp increase, deviating from the slope of the rest of the country, showing a significant increase in vaccination among males after the school entry requirement. So then our question was, we published this, but it can be criticized because it's parent report. So then we repeated the study. Recently, it's under review, hopefully on its second revised and resubmit, so hopefully will be accepted soon. But you can see it's actually almost identical. Females in Rhode Island, females in the rest of the country continues to be completely parallel. Males in Rhode Island, males in the rest of the country. And again, starting in 2015, this is sharp deviation upward. And again, with the provider-verified data, we find a significant increase in male vaccination in Rhode Island compared to the rest of the country. So I think having both sets of data, parent report, provider verified, show the exact same pattern of results is pretty persuasive that the school entry requirement worked. So do school entry requirements work for HPV vaccine? I would say yes, as long as the policy involves a true school entry requirement. So why were there no effects for girls in Rhode Island? So I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that in Rhode Island, HPV vaccination among girls was already incredibly high. And so what we may have been seeing was the ceiling effect, that it becomes increasingly difficult at very high levels to increase it incrementally beyond that. So it's also possible, and we have some ongoing work we're hoping to do with the Rhode Island State Department of Health to look at their registry data to see if the school entry requirement may have lowered the average age at which the vaccine was administered, which is almost certainly the case. So we may see more 11 and 12-year-olds vaccinated compared to 15 and 16-year-olds, for instance. And that's a really beneficial effect of the school entry requirement, because again, we want to vaccinate individuals before they're going to have sexual contact and potentially get infected. Number 6, we shouldn't talk about mandates because it's too controversial a topic and politically difficult. So it's certainly true that HPV vaccine school entry requirements are difficult to implement and can generate blowback. We saw that in 2006 and 2007 when there were efforts to implement some school entry requirements. But these kinds of challenges, I would argue, do not mean that we should be silent. We should be talking about school entry requirements and discussing the advantages and disadvantages. It should be an open discussion, and we should be thinking about research questions that we can answer around this issue. And most of all, I think it's easy to be silenced and intimidated by the anti-vaccine industry. I mean, this is a very coordinated, a small but very coordinated group of individuals who are very scared. They make death threats, they close down practices' websites, they will attack. There's a case of a colleague of mine who's a pediatrician in Pittsburgh, and he and his colleagues posted videos promoting HPV vaccine on their Facebook page. And someone decided to initiate a coordinated anti-vaccine attack on him, and people from all over the country and all over the world were attacking that practice and changing their ratings on Yahoo and on Google. So it's very intimidating. But I would argue very strongly that we should not be intimidated into silence by the anti-vaccine. I call them an industry for a reason, because there's a lot of money in the anti-vaccine movement. And that if we are intimidated into silence, then we've actually won one of the major battles. Some cautionary notes. So California, as you may know, had a measles outbreak in Disneyland that led to them changing their exemption policy. They now have only medical exemptions. And this was implemented in 2015. And you can see that there was a decrease in exemptions, but something happened, and there's always this law of unintended consequences. So it turns out that not all physicians are ethical. Who knew? So there were a bunch of physicians that were selling medical exemptions for about $80 a pop. And so that's where you see this sort of increase in medical exemptions actually went from this small percentage to a much larger percentage. So California has had to follow on with some additional legislation as a way of dealing with these rogue physicians who are just making money off of this. But you have to be aware, the more you restrict and tighten things up, the more people will look for ways around it, and the more unethical actors will try to take advantage of it. So school entry requirements may be particularly difficult to implement in states with existing very low vaccination rates. It puts a huge burden on schools and regulatory systems. And a colleague of mine at Boston University, Rebecca Perkins, has made this point. It's a good point. That if Mississippi next year implemented school entry requirements, going from their incredibly low vaccination rate, can you imagine the burden on the public health system and on the schools? So there are a lot of issues that need to be considered. And backlash is a real danger. So in Indiana, our state health department also has a public health authority to implement school entry requirements. They did so for meningococcal ACWY vaccine. Unlike most states, they've also done it for hepatitis A vaccine, because we've had some hepatitis A outbreaks. Implementing HPV vaccine requirements in Indiana is another issue that would generate huge backlash. Indiana is a very, very conservative state. So you have to consider these kinds of things and consider the potential backlash. Now in Rhode Island, which is not a particularly conservative state, they use public health authority. There was huge blowback, and there was some risk. There was a period of time when it looked like there was some risk that their public health authority would be taken away because of this. Now they persevered and they won, but in doing things like this, you have to be aware of the dangers and the risks and be prepared for them. So let me quickly go through some of the other, that's all I have on school entry requirements, it's a lot. Go through some of these other issues. So my colleague, I have a colleague at the University of South Florida, Ellen Daly, she wrote, along with me and some others, a couple of papers on what she calls the feminization of HPV. And this has been a long-standing problem. And part of it is historical. It's just that we knew about cervical cancer. we could screen for cervical cancer. You can't screen for really any of the other HPV-caused cancers. We didn't even know that HPV caused a lot of the other cancers that we now know about, that cause them in males as well as females. But it led to this kind of narrative that HPV is an infection of women and that it causes diseases of women, and that it's a problem for females but not for males. And we reinforce that with the term the cervical cancer vaccine, which is a term that is still used, and particularly in other countries is used pretty commonly. This was caused also obviously by the 5-year gap between the routine recommendation for girls and the routine recommendation for boys, and the fact that our public policy making body, the CDC and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, delayed harmonizing the recommendation for males and females until 2019. It was just this last year. It's an extraordinarily long time for them to leave a bad policy in place. So we're still fighting against this. There's still parents who don't understand why their sons need to be vaccinated against HPV. They sort of imagine, well, it's to protect girls from cervical cancer, and that's certainly true, but it's also to protect the boys from anal cancer and from oropharyngeal cancer, and penile cancer, which is very rare. They're pretty awful. So women bear the blame and the burden, but men get infected and transmit infection just like women. And as I just said, men suffer from HPV-related diseases. Also, a female-only approach leaves out important groups. Men who have sex with men are left unprotected by female-only vaccination. And they remain today an undervaccinated group. And this is some of the work that Holly and I have been doing, as well as looking at vaccination of young men who have sex with men. Also, elimination of cervical cancer, which is really an international goal now. Elimination doesn't mean zero, it means reducing it to like 4 in 100,000. If we want to eliminate that, if that's a major goal, we should, as much as possible, try to do gender-neutral vaccination. It decreases the time to elimination significantly. And then just a sort of an interesting thought experiment, right? So because of the delay in male approval of vaccination, the cost-effectiveness question was different. So with any other vaccine, we say, is it cost-effective to vaccinate everyone? If we're talking about meningococcal, ACWY vaccine, Tdap, MMR, any of these vaccines. What happened with HPV vaccine is they found it was cost-effective to vaccinate young women and girls. But then when it became approved for males, they didn't say, is it cost-effective to vaccinate everyone? They said, is it cost-effective to add male vaccination to female vaccination? Completely different question. And it subjected HPV vaccine in a way to, it subjected it to an expectation that no other vaccine has been expected to meet. So again, there's ongoing confusion around sex, gender, and HPV vaccination, different policies from country to country. Low-income countries can't afford to have gender-neutral vaccination. So there are realities on the ground that have to be faced. And in low-income countries, like oropharyngeal cancer is not a huge problem, but cervical cancer is devastating in these countries. So there is a global shortage of HPV vaccine. And it's a shortage, in some countries that need it the most. This is a significant problem. And it's related to a lot of difficulties, including difficulties upscaling production and the fact that every country has unique regulatory issues regarding manufacture and distribution. Now, the WHO, unfortunately, recently called for high-income countries to stop vaccinating males until there's no more shortage. This, I was just flabbergasted about this. For someone like me who's been advocating for male vaccination for since 2011 or before, I was just taken aback by this. So it's part of it is based on this faulty assumption that if we use vaccine here, it somehow deprives other countries of vaccine, which is not the case. And it also presumes that national policies can be turned off and on like a light switch. And when I think about how long it took to harmonize male and female recommendations in this country, policy in this country moves really, really slowly. And it would be extraordinarily destructive for us to now say, oh yeah, HPV vaccination was important for males, and just say, oh, actually, just kidding. We're just going to stop doing it. So I was very frustrated that they came out with this position. My hope is, and my expectation is, that it won't affect our policy in this country. So let me talk briefly about shared clinical decision-making. This is the recommendation for all adults ages 27 through 45. And when the CDC published guidance on this, they have a kind of a call-out box saying, these are considerations to consider, for shared clinical decision-making. So one of the things they say is ideally should be given in early adolescence. Absolutely true, because that's when it's most effective. So, but for adults 27 to 45 who are not adequately vaccinated, clinicians can consider discussing HPV vaccination with persons who are most likely to benefit. And then they say, problematically, HPV vaccination does not need to be discussed with most adults ages over 26 years. So I don't know if people here know what shared clinical decision-making is. It's really hard to imagine shared clinical decision-making happening if you don't bring up the topic. And I know, I'm not a physician, I'm not a pediatrician, but I work with them. And I know that pediatricians and family physicians and clinicians of all types are not very good at determining who's at risk and who's not at risk, and who would benefit and who would not benefit. So if you're going to have shared clinical decision-making, you have to talk about it. You have to talk about it with all of your patients. It doesn't mean that all of your patients, or even most of your patients, need the vaccine, but you can't do this without discussing it. So that some of the guidelines are useful, and there are kind of points that should be part of that shared clinical decision-making discussion. One of the ones that really bugs me is this one that I put in blue, where they say, persons who are in long-term mutually monogamous sexual partnerships are not likely to acquire an infection. This is a bizarre statement in a lot of ways, because a certain percentage of people who think they're in a long-term mutually monogamous relationship are not in a mutually monogamous relationship, and they don't know. The other thing is, clinicians are extraordinarily bad at determining whether a patient is in a long-term mutually monogamous sexual relationship. They don't know how to ask the question, they don't ask it, they don't have time to ask it. If you think about what happens in primary care, clinicians are asked to do more and more and more in less time. The typical contact period is like 10 minutes in primary care. They're not going to be doing a complicated risk assessment around this. I also do HIV prevention research. And when I saw this, it's like brought back bad memories of like 20 years ago when this was part of the HIV sort of mantra. People in long-term monogamous sexual partnerships don't need to worry about HIV. In the HIV world, that term, people don't say this anymore. So it really troubled me that this is I guess what you would call a zombie recommendation, because it just won't go away in time. Is a one-dose recommendation on the horizon? Probably. So there's a lot of evidence from epidemiological studies that one dose provides really good protection, both from the clinical trials where they look at people who happen to just get one dose, and they find that it's quite effective at preventing pre-cervical lesions. There's also studies from big databases like you may be familiar with NHANES, that also seems to show that one dose provides protection. There are currently clinical trials going on, at least in Costa Rica and maybe some other countries, to look at the efficacy of one dose. If those trials come back with very favorable findings, the FDA may very well approve one dose, but not anytime really soon, but I think eventually. And so just to summarize, there's significant geographic and urban-rural disparities in HPV vaccination. Nationally, we're still not close to the 2020 goal. Implementation of disclosure requirements is an important and I believe ethical approach to increasing vaccination rates and importantly to reducing disparities. I think that school entry requirements should be considered among multiple approaches to improving HPV vaccination. We have to recognize that it's a heavy lift and going to be impossible in some states, like my home state of Indiana. But I don't think we should be silent. We should be talking about this. We should be engaging in research around this issue, and we should keep pushing the envelope and pushing the bar. And just to say a final slide, this is one of my favorite slides. So this is a cartoon from 1807. So we sometimes we think, well, anti-vaccine sentiment, that's all happened over the last 15, 20 years. That's not true. It's always been with us. It waxes and wanes over the years. So this is a cartoon from 1807. And here you see Jenner, the developer of smallpox vaccine, depicted with horns. He's dumping healthy babies with his compatriots into this mouth of this horrible cow that has these pucks on the side that are dripping. And here they're shoveling the babies who now have little horns into this cart. And here are the anti-vaccine people coming to save the day. And it was felt very strongly in those days that smallpox vaccine could lead to pestilence. It's hard to read, but that's what is said on the cow's body. That it would open Pandora's box. That it could lead to leprosy, plague, and the most feared thing of all, fetid ulcers. And I'll stop. There's another cartoon which I'll leave with you with, but it's a pro-vaccine cartoon from the early 1800s as well. And I'm happy to take any questions.